Guys, if I have the chance to introduce you to Jesse Cox, an OG streamer from Twitch, I encourage you to go over there. He is the only one-time subscription on Twitch, still intact, which is pretty cool. And he's been playing a lot of Final Fantasy this last year. And the last 3 or 4 weeks, I feel like, he spent a lot of time kind of sharing the script and sharing his progress, both on Twitter and live on stream. And so it is here. It is finally here. This is a long video. And let's get started on seeing what he believes 15 years of WoW versus 1 year of 14 is. Be warned, this production quality is way, way, way above anything I have ever made. I can already guarantee it. And I encourage you to go give this another watch immediately after. If you haven't seen it before this, maybe see it before this.
To notice a lot of familiar faces from the World of Warcraft community, taking another look at Final Fantasy XIV. So today, I want to talk about the differences between these two games, that while sharing many similar
Come on, quality. Come on, quality. Dial it up.
concepts, diverge in their execution of the MMO genre. As a fan of both games and 15-year veteran of WoW, I've often thought about this subject as I now play through Final Fantasy XIV on a near-daily basis since August of last year. I frequently get asked to compare the two, and the simplest way I've been able to do so is the following. World of Warcraft is an MMORPG, while Final Fantasy XIV is an RPG MMO. What does this mean besides hopefully sounding clever? In Final Fantasy XIV, the entire creative process, the direction, the core concepts, all of it are approached from an intrinsically different design philosophy than that of Warcraft. So it doesn't mean you can't enjoy both, it just means they're made for two very different gamers. Let me explain.
So the two very different gamers, I think, is a nice thing to say in our space. Because WoW players and 14 players that play exclusively one or exclusive the other feel very different about people who are on the other side. Keep in mind, this is very much like people who are two fans of two very different sports teams for the same sport. Every other sport thinks you guys are doing pretty much the same thing. First-person shooters, MOBAs, racing games, puzzle games, mobile games. When they look at WoW and 14, the reasons that one does not fit them might also appeal to the other. They may just not be okay with the entire genre because they are in the same genre.
I think most people have an understanding of what an MMORPG is beyond any sort of definition. There are expectations as to what that experience will be, which is why after playing Final Fantasy XIV, I've come to call it an RPG MMO. Because while all the multiplayer elements are there, I believe they aren't entirely necessary. If the MMO were removed and all we were left with was the RPG, the story, the music, the gameplay, it feels like the player would still have a complete experience. This is because the team behind Final Fantasy XIV, from its inception, has put its focus squarely on storytelling. This design choice then influences every other aspect of the game.
I mean, that makes sense when you look at the story franchise of what a Final Fantasy series is, right? The combat systems have been drastically different over the years as platforms have changed, as what the goal of the game has changed. Even combat systems, when you talk about like Final Fantasy X versus X-2, they're drastically different feeling games. Even though like what's at its core within Final Fantasy is a narrative telling experience, as opposed to Blizzard games have story present. There is world building happening in many of those, but it doesn't feel as front and center across the entire company as gameplay first.
From characters to world building to music to animation, all serve to enhance the storytelling. It is without a doubt the single most vital aspect of Final Fantasy XIV. Everything comes from the story, everything is related to the story, and everything exists to service the story. So as we move forward in this video, you'll see every time I bring up a comparison or idea in Final Fantasy XIV, it's going to be in some way related to the story. And it's because of this one fact that Final Fantasy and WoW can still feel similar to a player moving between the two, but also be vastly different experiences. Let me just throw this out there. What was the story of vanilla World of Warcraft? If you had to think, it's because there was no story. There were quests, there was lore, certainly different adventures to get involved in, but no overarching story. There was no driving force behind what you were doing, besides the desire to gain levels, abilities, to see what's around the next bend or explore the next zone. The story of the World of Warcraft was what you, the player, made it. It was trying to find the right Zevras in the Barrens. It was sneaking into the undeveloped Mount Hyjal. It's trying to raid the enemy capital. Those were the experiences we remember. In fact, the most recent example of a great WoW memory I have is getting the Alliance Horde Slayer title and that achievement in BFA. The whole point is that you kill enough enemy players to literally be marked on the map as a bounty, and then people try to come kill you, and if you survive long enough, you get an achievement.
It is probably my favorite moment in BFA, was when I got the achievement he's describing. I was a Guardian Druid, I was out questing with friends, and we had come across several Alliance and killed them. And suddenly, you know, we'd had people go down, but I just happened to have not died all day. And so suddenly I was marked, and we didn't, I mean, the expansion was still new. I didn't really know what that was. And one of my friends told me, oh my gosh, you're marked. We have to get you this achievement. And so suddenly my friend's sole goal was to help me escape things, was to help me be alive and just to get away, while they, of course, were killing these Alliance that were chasing me down. And as long as I was tagging them, as long as I was involved, like, you're keeping this honorable kill, and you feel like this flag bearer in this open world moment. PvP in games is one of the more like emergent sandbox style things, and so when PvP enters a space, be it EVE Online or Guild Wars 2 or WoW, it does drive what people's favorite memories are. Now, those favorite memories are locked behind hours and hours that are often filled with pain, but because the PvP is so lacking and the single player story is so dominant in 14, it doesn't really lend itself to moments like that being your favorite memories.
Was one of the most exhilarating recent memories I have in the game. I loved every moment of it. In Final Fantasy XIV, if you ask someone their favorite moment, and I did, almost every single person is going to say theirs is related to story. Obviously, this isn't every player, as many players find the same camaraderie and
I think that's going to vary heavily with who you ask. I think if you're somebody who likes story, you're going to find yourself in an aspect of the 14 community, which is the majority, that does care for story, somewhere between a little and a lot. If you go into streams such as Xenosis or Arthur's, where rating is the focus, if you go into streams where story is just not what's happening, something like Llama Todd or Mr. Happy, there are people that are there talking about the class design. They're talking about their favorite moments in tanking or their favorite moments in healing, how class changes over the years have made the game something they enjoy more or less, talking about when they finished their first solo run of Palace of the Dead or Heaven on High. There are other moments that are key, but when you talk to the majority of the player base inside a community that already cares for lore, right? If you go to any Ethos stream and you ask, of course story is going to be the response.
Accomplishment as WoW players when taking down harder bosses. But for the majority of players, the story is not just an important part of the game, it's also something that binds the community together. With that said, after years of playing WoW, to say there isn't a fan base for the world or story building they're doing would be foolish, as I am one of them. But let's be real. The majority of players simply do not care about the plot of Warcraft. I'd have to guess that's because it was never really the driving force of the game that got them playing in the first place, and more importantly, sticking with it. The fact is, as Blizzard moves more towards storytelling in their more recent expansions, they've developed multiple ways of getting across major plot information to players who may be interested, but it's not integral for the player's enjoyment. It's this delivery that provides the necessary surface-level context to keep a player engaged, but has also formed a complicated relationship with players who do enjoy story and world building in Warcraft. Team leads and devs change, shifting the vision for each expansion to fit what is essentially the rule of cool. While main story beats are planned ahead, it's very clear that things have changed or will change based on necessity. Main characters vanish, story elements are left behind, and lore is retconned to fit with the moment. As a big old lore nerd, years of that have definitely left me kinda jaded when it comes to WoW. A silly example is years ago at BlizzCon, I asked the devs about that weird snake tail and Gundrak. I was like, what is that thing? Their response then, and ever since, has pretty much been, we really don't know. Perhaps it was snuck in, perhaps it was dropped content, who knows? All I can say is, if it was in Final Fantasy XIV, that snake tail would not only have had a purpose, but it would have shown up 2 expansions later as an important character in an ongoing story. Yep, this is going to be one of those videos that's long enough to be split into multiple parts. But it's good, because it allows us to dive a little deeper. When it comes to content, both games feature the staples of the MMORPG genre to differing degrees. Leveling, dungeons, raids, PvP, special events, grinds, and daily quests. In fact, some on the two dev teams are friends, and they definitely borrow ideas from each other all the time. Yoshi P, the director of Final Fantasy XIV, is notably a huge Blizzard fan. The difference, of course, comes from what the dev teams have decided the focus of their games should be. The best way I can simplify this is to say that Warcraft is more about the destination, and Final Fantasy XIV is more about the journey. As an example, in WoW, the leveling process in, say, a new expansion is a buffer between you and max level where the real game starts. I was once told by a friend that he always thought of it as advertisement for places that later on at max level you'll spend time grinding. Once you've leveled up, you can begin doing harder dungeons, farming gear in Mythic Plus, running raids, joining PvP battlegrounds or arenas, and doing your
Maybe. I think there's still a push when a new player says that the game is very slow for them, or that they're not feeling engaged with their class, where we tell them, well, don't worry, when you get to Heaven's Word, it'll be more your thing. Don't worry. And so I think there is still a kind of dragging along of the new player through this first several hundred hours. I will say there's a different level of rejoice there in World of Warcraft when somebody's leveling and they say, hey, you know, I'm level 40. I'm almost, somebody's like, oh, so you haven't really played yet. As opposed to in Final Fantasy, we have this almost odd fascination with going into Sprout streams and cheering people on. So there is a positivity around that experience that's different. But both games are pretty quick to point out that somebody doesn't really know what they're talking about if they're beginning to feel like they have some strong impressions, if those impressions differ from our own. If they're done with ARR and they already feel the way we do at the end, then we cheer them on. But if they get to the end of ARR and say, I don't think this game's for me, there are portions of the 14 community that will come out and be very vocal against them. And so I think in both cases, the game is heavily judged based on what its most recent content is. Which is geared towards people who are max level, have been playing for some length of time, whether they just hit max level or they've been here for many, many years. Both games are heavily focused on that. A lot of times what you see people comparing is the state of the games now. It's one of the things that I find myself defending WoW on quite a bit in a lot of these comparison videos, because people are quick to point out the health of, they'll be talking about, hey, I just started playing 14 and A Realm Reborn is so good, and Shadowlands doesn't even have a patch. That's not fair. You're comparing something that's already released with something that just came out. So I would say I don't know that that's as true. I think something is more true when you compare these two to something else entirely. When you compare these two to something that does not move the level cap every 2 years and then everybody races up it and then chases item levels that reset every patch cycle. I think that in many ways these games both have a huge emphasis on a moving target that is called Endgame, that is continually here. And I say that because if you go try to find groups for E1 through 8S right now, you're going to have trouble, and people are going to go, you should really just do 9 through 12. And so I think that it's heavily emphasized on that. Now, with that being said, of course, Shadowbringers has had an incredibly consistent cycle, COVID included, compared to Shadowlands, which is one of the reasons people are so quick to dismiss all of 15 years of WoW history, because Shadowlands is in a really rough spot.
daily quests are grinding rep. And for years, this has not only been a pretty standard MMORPG cycle, but WoW has been the best at it. The goal, of course, is keeping players engaged and logged in. And going back to our original story discussion, doing most of these things continues the Warcraft story as well. In Final Fantasy XIV, it's a bit different. With the story being the most important part, this means leveling isn't just a rush to max level to experience the cool parts. The cool parts are the leveling. At max level, there are certainly raids and dailies and grinds and PvP, but they're nowhere near the complexity of WoW. Leveling up a job in Final Fantasy XIV isn't just about the leveling process either. Sure, in WoW you can level up an alt, experience the other faction's story, and a lot of people enjoy that. But in Final Fantasy XIV, each job has its own story and quests associated with it. They're varying in size and scope, but like The Dark Knight, for example, is universally loved for being some of the best storytelling in the game. But again, story is what it's about. Most large-scale raids only have one difficulty level and are more events than actual team-building struggles. Those raids and trials that do have harder modes are canonically fan fiction versions of the events, so players who are just there for the story won't miss anything if they don't have time for harder content. PvP, while vibrant.
The exception being the scene change for the end of a Savage tier. That feels very canonical to me. It feels like a reveal compared to the rest, which are indeed ignorable. I think that it is weird that WoW ties so much story behind the raid for not being a narrative build-up in the same way that 14 is. 14 actually segments off your 8-man content into 2 other storylines, and so an MSQ-only player can largely ignore that until they feel like playing with other players, as opposed to WoW, for the fact that story is not at the top of their list, it feels odd to me that a story-based player would be forced to raid to really feel fulfilled. And because of things like the public test realm, we already know, as of today, which tomorrow, at the time of this filming, is when 9.1 finally releases after months of waiting. And we already know who the final raid boss is. And so there is a different level of focus and emphasis on it. 14 protects its story. The quests are left with question marks in the patch notes. There is a lot of teasing and stuff around the events building up to it. We don't have a public test realm, and players as a result take that very seriously. Players as a result, to the point where they can almost be forceful, telling a new player, hey, you really shouldn't be in this chat right now. I've seen that tossed around, they want to protect somebody. It's not that person's choice whether or not it's spoiler. They're like, no, you should really go do your story before being in this conversation sometimes. And so it's protected to this high degree, we're holding the story up. And WoW really just, the moment somebody doesn't like it, they're like, well, then don't do it. And so it's immediately seen as this more optional piece. These games are made of the same components. They're cut from the same cloth. They just put them in a different order of priority. And the fact that story sits so high on 14s and sits so low on WoWs is something that takes years to drive in. Shadowlands has, in my opinion, put the most focus on story since Wrath of the Lich King. It's a heavy emphasis. Had it had a normal patch schedule, I think this would have been narratively the most content in quantity that we would have gotten from a story perspective as far as meaningful and big things. Now, whether or not you enjoy them, whether or not they're well written, is much more complicated. But that's the change there. 14 has had that consistency. He talked about the turnover within the WoW team. The lore side of 14 has been incredibly consistent, and that allows them to build on something. World of Warcraft players look at the fact that team leads and everything changes so much with the way they handle crafting expansion to expansion. So much that they change the way the loot progression changes expansion to expansion. Everything within WoW is always seeking change. It's always seeking the next thing around the corner to excite people, and 14 just isn't. 14 is consistent to the point where veteran players that don't widen what they're interested in, they're just interested in the same thing each patch, can almost become jaded in this 2 tomes in a raid repetition, because that consistency is the strength that they build on, and it is outrageously consistent. It has actually shocked us how much over Shadowbringers they've broken portions of their pattern, because at the beginning of Shadowbringers, I believe Mr. Happy, one of the largest creators in the 14 space as far as YouTube plus Twitch, put out a video saying here's what the patch schedule is, guys. And he didn't do that from some secret reveal, from some leak. He did that from years and years of covering this game to say, hey, let me just lay down the foundation for any new players right now. And when you watch it, that's because he's assuming that the 5.12345 will follow the exact same as 4.12345, 3.12345. We have a pattern, and the execution might vary, right? We knew that Bosja would be slightly different than Eureka, but we knew that certain things would be there and certain things wouldn't. And there's new content. We got Ishgard Restoration layered on top, and that's why we see number of dungeons per patch come down. That's why we've dropped from 3 jobs to 2 jobs, right? We get less of these repeating things to make room for something new, but it's outrageously, reliably consistent.
Brint is nothing close to that of WoW. Reputations and dailies exist, but not in a way that forces the player to spend a significant amount of time investing in them. But you're rewarded in a way that makes it feel like you're kind of getting one over on the devs for the amount of time you actually put into it. Let me give you some specific examples. Let's talk reputation grinds. Admittedly, in WoW, I haven't played much beyond the start of max level content in Shadowlands, and this may be different, but if we look at most reputation grinds, it's usually something along the lines of like, you earn 750 rep a day with a weekly bonus of some sort, and you need 40 to 50k rep to reach Exalted. So you're looking at, I don't know, over a month of rep farming to reach max reputation. This, of course, is part of the design philosophy again, to keep you engaged in the world longer. In Final Fantasy XIV, while some of the older reputations are pretty similar, the newer ones, take Pixies for example, are designed not only to be fast, but to feel very rewarding. Every day you get 3 quests that take roughly 15 minutes to complete, and as a reward, you get tons of reputation, tokens that you can eventually buy rep items with, and then loads of experience. I'm talking like a quarter of your XP bar for 3 quests. And this is great because not only does it make grinding rep easy, but it also rewards you for doing it on one of your other jobs, incentivizing you to level additional classes. Let's take another example. Unlocking Flight. In WoW, unlocking Flight has always been a process. A thing that you really had to earn.
Actually, it's just varied. It has not always been a process. I think he's played 15 years of WoW. Vanilla, there was no flight. The Burning Crusade, it was not a process. The Wrath of the Lich King, I believe it was handed to you as a requirement for leveling through some of the zones, and then you bought faster flight. So flight is another example of where WoW has continually moved the goalpost, and so we go into an expansion, we set a goal. And so in Warlords of Draenor, they aimed to get rid of flight, and instead, when people balked at that, they said, fine, we're going to do a path called Pathfinder. And so I think as soon as we got out of Wrath, things have shifted continually, and they've kept moving the goalpost. And it's no longer just a, do you have the gold? And it's much more of a question of, are you willing to do all of these checkboxes? And Pathfinder was this process that was meant to take basically a year. To put it in 14 terms, you would have to have max rep with all of the beast tribes, including ones that were not released at launch, which means there is a inherent time gate just baked in, as well as you would maybe need to go complete all the story in the zones. Of course, you need to complete all your MSQ, and then you would have to maybe complete like your sightseeing log. And so that kind of makes up Pathfinder, and it forces you into aspects of content that maybe you don't want to do. I think as players adjusted to what that is, right, as in BFA, people learned to get around and take advantage of the way the Flight Master's whistle worked and all of that. Right as I feel like they started to settle into an idea where either people who can't handle it have quit and people who can have learned to make do, they move the goalpost again this expansion. And so they don't stick with anything long enough to make a player base entirely made up of people that can either tolerate or even enjoy that content. They keep moving it around. And so the people who might like Pathfinder, I'm sure they exist. Are they going to like what the system is in 10.0? Who knows? They're just winging it. And 14 is incredibly consistent. As soon as they added flying, they're like, hey, we've got these basically little currents you got to go grab, these aether currents, which are like these little sightseeing points. They're easy to get to. We'll give you a compass to send you the nearest one, and then we'll give you a handful through each zone. Because the zones are segregated, you can actually unlock flying one zone at a time. World of Warcraft could do that in Shadowlands, because Shadowlands is substantially more fragmented than previous expansions have been, where you can kind of fly over a whole continent. And honestly, what's weird about it is while I resented Pathfinder when I came back to WoW in Legion, this expansion, I really missed my Flight Master's whistle. This expansion, I really felt like, so do I not need to be doing the reps? Or like, and it just felt like they just shook it on me. And so that fact that they keep moving it, I think, is what makes flying so frustrating. in games that these two games basically handle flying the same way once you have it unlocked. It's skins on mounts that you just move up, down, left, right, backward, forward at a speed faster than walking. They're basically identical, especially when you compare to something more unique like the Guild Wars 2 mount system.
Currently, I think to unlock flight, it's something like getting Renown 44 and completing the last sigil and having completed Chapter 12 of the Covenant campaign, receiving memories to unlock account-wide flying, and then you can do it in Shadowlands. In Final Fantasy XIV, while exploring the map that you're already exploring anyway, you use a compass to find little green wind orbies, and when you find them all and you complete the area story arc, you unlock flying for that specific zone. It's not account-wide, but it's easy enough to get just by going.
Account-wide's a touchy issue in 14 because the devs, when they first built the game, did not design you to need multiple alts, and as people have had reasons to create multiple alts, the game just simply is not designed to accommodate it, because remember, you can play every class on one character, so it doesn't need to be account-wide for the vast majority of the player base, but for the ones that it does, it's incredibly frustrating that it's not.
Going through the leveling process. From a design standpoint, I love this! When I first learned this is how you got flying in Final Fantasy XIV, I was actually angry about all the time WoW made me waste. In Final Fantasy XIV, you get to experience the zone, which is what WoW's trying to get you to do, but 14 doesn't gate your ability to move through it quicker in the future behind some sort of grind. Which has probably got a few of you now thinking, Jesse, you're making it seem like you don't have to work for much in Final Fantasy XIV. But of course you do. There are things like fancy relic weapon grinds and stuff like that, but not nearly to the degree that WoW makes you grind out stuff. Honestly, I think...
Unless you want the grind. What the keyword is makes you. That's the keyword you use there. Makes you. If you want a grind, it's there, I promise. Go look up what it takes to get the pterodactyl mount. It's insane. Like, there are grinds in this game, and there are people that find them. And for people that feel that they want the rewards that are there for those grinds, they even sometimes resent those grinds. So the complaints exist. The difference is that one piece of content is not locked behind another pieces of content grind. If you don't like the relic system, and you like extreme and savage raiding, then just don't get your relic. Just don't. And so it becomes so much more optional. If you don't like crafting and gathering, you are not going to like the rebuilding of a city that we did this expansion, where you basically just craft and gather. So don't do it. You really have an option what you engage in and what you don't, and each piece of content has to stand on its own. That's not that what you do in one piece of content won't help you and prepare you for the next piece of content. It's that we're never going to say, hey, to get to the next step, you have to go do this thing. As a matter of fact, the Relic Grind, this expansion, added 2 paths to the vast majority of the steps that let you kind of choose the way you get through it. And so if you can imagine people getting your legendaries in WoW, if you could get Soul Ash, and for different legendaries, maybe you could go farm, it's like, hey, this conduit or this Soul Ash could be, for this particular legendary, can be gathered from, of course, doing Torghast and the Maw, of course, but also, what if instead you just went off and did this other thing? What if instead you just ran a heroic 10 times? What if instead you just went off and did 2 caches of your choosing? And so there's just this better use of it. And actually what's clever is that second path was legacy stuff. It was, what if you went and did time walking? What if you went and what if your legendary had a unique skin if you instead unlocked it through Chromie time on an alt? Like, what if we let you say, hey, here's the current content, Torghast and Maw. This is the primary method. We encourage you to at least try it. But if you don't like this, go level some alts through Chromie time for whatever expansion you may have missed or want to go back and re-experience, and we'll give you that same legendary. All we're looking for is to reward people for playing our game. We're not looking to punish them by making them do one particular piece of content if it's not their thing.
We're so used to Blizzard making us go through content multiple times for months in order to unlock something like flying that anything less seems ridiculously easy. But that shouldn't be the case, gang. I don't know anyone who enjoys it, but we still do it. It all just comes down to the fact that the Final Fantasy XIV devs are not trying to keep you in their world for countless hours. So it seems like everything is a little easier. The fact is, the 14 devs have literally said they don't care if you log in every day. Get what you want from their game, come back when you want more. Instead,
keep in mind that quote that you can take breaks comes from it most commonly refers back to an origin point of a Q&A when a player asked Yoshi P, hey, I want to be playing your game right now, but I don't really have anything to do in it. Have you guys thought about, are you guys looking to add anything that would help me have something to do in your game? And he responded by saying, take a break. And that's an example of kind of that moment where the dev has to reveal their true intentions. That same moment with a WoW dev is usually where we get these really unfortunate quotes. These, don't you have phones? You think you do, but you don't. And so it's come out multiple times. That's the origin point that most people refer back to. But when you have these moments that come up, right, every hour or every year, every 2 years, where there's this moment that kind of slips out, that's where you get to feel, what is that? And I think that 14 in general really does feel go play other games. There are exceptions. So if you have a house, you better limit how long your break is. If you have stuff planted in your garden plot, you better really limit how long your break is. You're going to need to log in or have somebody help log in to help you. Right? And because that content was originally designed to be done as a guild where everybody could help you keep that garden plot watered. There are moments in this that reward you for logging in to do dailies and do weeklies. They exist. The people who have done them every day for many days on end don't feel as far ahead, don't feel as uncatchable, even if they are. If you look at somebody who's done their cookie dailies, and which is a money-making method, and somebody who has maxed all their reps and is doing all their relics and all of that, they can be miles and miles ahead of you, but it doesn't feel like, well, because of that, they're also better at running dungeons. They're also better at running raids. It feels like, no, because of that, they have cool, shiny stuff that I don't have. Cool.
The grindy bits of Final Fantasy XIV are something entirely different. I recently saw this ad for Final Fantasy XIV, and it made me laugh, because I've never seen anything like this for WoW, but most Final Fantasy XIV players will tell you this is where the majority of your max level adventure lies. Look at this thing. Gathering, crafting, free companies or guilds, housing, fashion, the gold saucer, which is like a permanent version of the Darkmoon Fair, and I'll be honest, yeah, this is pretty much Endgame in Final Fantasy XIV. That's not to say 14 doesn't have challenging content for those looking for a more traditional MMO raiding experience, but like, the point I'm trying to make is that in WoW, the endgame focus is on harder and harder raiding and mythics, PvP, both arena, battleground, and world, with all the other things in the game existing to aid in doing so. In 14, the endgame focus is more diverse. Although there are Savage and Ultimate difficulty raids designed for those who want a more challenging experience, there's also things like building a cool guild house, or crafting a special weapon from a weird boss drop, or going on treasure hunts. There's more to do than just raiding for the sake of raiding. Speaking of crafting...
That's true in WoW too. When you look at, unfortunately, Shadowlands, much like Shadowbringers dropped Deep Dungeon, unfortunately Shadowlands dropped adding support to their treasure hunting system, Archaeology. But there are things going on in WoW. It's one of the reasons that I quit the first time. During Pandaria, I was trying to do all these other things. I was trying to, in the time, they had like a little Farmville type game. Pet battles had gone to a new level. There was all of these other types of things. When you talk about challenge modes, when you talk about going back and grinding up old transmogs, when you talk about all these things there was to do, going and getting involved in crafting and gathering and unlocking all the mounts and going and doing all that, I felt very frustrated because I felt like I still had to maintain my chore list to be prepped for raid that week and do all of this. And so the reason I think a lot of WoW players forget how broad their game is because to get to all of that, you have to disengage from mainline content. You have to unplug from the current patch cycle. To make time, you either have to play an incredibly large number of hours, or you have to be okay only getting to one or two things outside of your mainline schedule. And so for me, what I found was I let mine become a full-time job. But as I've gone back through BFA, I spent very, very, very little time in Zandalar. I spent very little time there. Yes, I went, and when friends wanted to do dailies, I went and did dailies with them. They always outgeared me because they were raiding. For me, BFA was a chance to go back and fill in all the gaps, go back and experience things that I've missed over the years, go back and finish up Lore Master in zones, go back and grind up pets I've been missing, and go see raids that maybe I didn't make it to or didn't get the drop I wanted from, such as mounts or really cool transmogs. Go back and do all of these things I'd never done before. Fishing in the underbelly and all of that. And I think that that's where the problem is that I didn't get to shape my experience. And so anything that I didn't get to didn't exist. WoW is an incredibly diverse game. And so when devs feel this need to put in retention mechanic after retention mechanic after retention mechanic, it feels like they're not trusting themselves to make a good game. They have a lot there. There's a lot of meat on the bone. When you look at total amount of content available in the entirety of the game to full clear a game, WoW and 14 are both massive, absolutely massive. Getting every single achievement, getting every single thing done is a massive undertaking in either game, no matter how long you've been playing. It's huge. I think that WoW just needs to be better about trusting that people will go find those things, trusting that people will find reasons to stay logged in, that you don't need to give them an alarm clock that makes them check back in for a mission table. You can just say, hey, wasn't it so much fun last time you played? Don't you want to log back in and get back to having fun?
I think one of the biggest issues I have with WoW is that crafting for so long has seemed totally pointless once Looking for Raid was created. Any gear you could craft, say as a leather worker, was useless for those who could just get raid gear easily. Meanwhile, in Final Fantasy XIV, gathering and crafting is very much a major part of the endgame experience. If you're curious about other...
The vast majority of items he scrolled through are also useless, just to be clear. So it's not that we have some a magical use for legacy crafts. The vast majority of items you can craft in the game are not needed.
Other things, PvP for example, I mean, in this case, WoW definitely wins this one. There is PvP in Final Fantasy XIV in the form of war games, and there are many people who enjoy it. It's just that there's a wider variety and larger community in WoW. It is, after all, part of the core concept, faction warfare. This doesn't exist in 14. There are no warring player factions. In fact, much of the story is about getting all the nations of the world on the same team. The funny thing is, as WoW attempts to add more story, the PvP they're doing makes less and less sense narratively. And that's, just the tip of the iceberg of the endgame experience. There's a lot more to talk about, but since we are talking endgame, I think we should flip it and do the starting experience. Going back to the design philosophies of the two games, we can see differences in the premise of each and how it affects your intro into the game. In World of Warcraft, you start your experience as just one of the many faces in service of your chosen faction. Over time, your actions in defeating various threats increase your importance to the world. In Final Fantasy XIV, you are literally the Warrior of Light, the chosen hero from moment one. There is no denying your importance to the story. The entire narrative revolves around you. Even though initially you're not recognized as such, that's what you are. Quickly proving yourself to the world. From that point on, every character not only acknowledges you, but they recognize the importance of your role over theirs. So add that to the story being the most important element, and you'll see how this might be a daunting task for some new players. Much of the 14 starting experience it's pretty slow. World building, character introduction, lasting roughly the first 50 levels. I actually think this is one of the biggest problems Final Fantasy XIV has, as it's a hard sell to explain how phenomenal this game becomes only after you put in 40 hours. But that's exactly what I was told, and what I have told others, because it's true. The strong connection to narrative hurts the starting experience, especially for new players who may have friends playing or seen an amazing moment from a recent expansion, but they can't play it themselves without playing through 100 hours of story or paying for a skip and finding themselves completely disconnected from the plot. And that is a real shame, because the game uses all of that story and setup to build out the rest of the world. So if you skip over the starting experience, the amount of stuff you miss is mind-boggling. And because the story is so well told, and all the characters and locations and factions, etc., are so perfectly fit into the puzzle that is the main plot, that when twists happen, they make perfect sense.
Perfectly fit, I don't know that I would go that far to say. So he's talking about the premise of the game. So let's talk about vanilla versus A Realm Reborn, because 1.0 was thrown in the bin. So The devs have come out since A Realm Reborn and have said at the time of design that they actually had a ratio of this much story, this much cutscene, this much, actual like quest text being presented conversationally and all of that, like what's being seen on the screen right now, versus how much gameplay. And when they went back in 5.3 to cull the new experience, to go back and remove 100 of those quests, a lot of the reason they were able to remove those quests was because there were 100 quests of bloat that had been put in because either the gameplay needed to be there, so we had to create a reason to, I need you to go do this thing because we've got to get back to our almighty ratio, or we've got to be able to go back and add story, even though there's nothing fancy about the story in this moment. And so there was a lot of weak quests in there. There are also quests that just didn't make sense because we went back and we added a Realm Reborn flying, so we don't need to have quests that teach you about what flying is because it's going to be handled differently. So like there's a number of quests in there that got trimmed because the design philosophy has changed. Now go compare that to World of Warcraft. And so when you talk about their premise, at the beginning, World of Warcraft, I don't think knew what it was as much as Final Fantasy did. Because Final Fantasy was a relaunch with 2.0 and had the inspiration of an established genre that had blown up well beyond the niche that it was before World of Warcraft. World of Warcraft came out and said, we simply want to be different than the other guys. We want to be different than EverQuest. So we know we want a different graphic style because we want to set ourselves apart. But when you look at their first dungeons, when you look at their first raids, it is very clear that they don't know what they're doing. They don't know what their goal is because they change so much. And so they're still trying to find their way. Arguably, still to this day, they're still changing so much. And so I think when you go compare them both, I think 14 came in on a lot stronger footing than WoW. I think WoW was fun because of reasons that they didn't necessarily anticipate. The original devs of WoW have come out and said they thought they were building this world about your adventure, or about this journey into this world and making your place in it. But in hindsight, the star of the show, the star of this, was not any of the characters they made. It was not you. The star of the show in the World of Warcraft vanilla was the world of Warcraft. And that's something that just came out of that. And so I think comparing them both at their premise, in my mind, 14 not only came in on a stronger identity, but because of that identity, it's actually kept that identity today. While the execution is very, very different between Shadowbringers and A Realm Reborn, it is iterative how we got there, and you can still see A Realm Reborn in much of what Shadowbringers has today. It is different as it is a better and more developed version. World of Warcraft doesn't even resemble what vanilla was. It is a totally different game. Playing Classic and playing Retail are two entirely different experiences. And so I think when you compare where they were to where they are, that's actually one of the areas that it's less informative to compare where WoW was to where it is, because I don't even know that the original intentions are still intact.
When reveals are made, it's like, oh yeah, of course! All because of that level 1 through 50 experience laying the foundation. And as I've said, I've experienced both ends of this. Years ago when the game first came out, I gave it a shot, and around level 40 was totally burnt out. It wasn't until I returned last year looking for something new that I gave the game a second chance on the recommendation of a friend. I'm so glad I listened, because for a fan of a story like me, what this game offers is a fantastic experience. Sadly, the reason behind Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn's slow start can be traced back to its origins as a reboot of the disaster that was the original Final Fantasy XIV. The budget was small, the timetable was short, and it shows. It isn't until the later patches of A Realm Reborn and the release of the first expansion, Heavensward, that the game truly shines. The production value skyrockets, the writing is less long-winded, the voice actors change, just about everything is better than where it started. And universally, everyone acknowledges this fact, which is why I assume the free trial, with memes and all, includes Heavensward. If you're gonna keep playing the game, it's the first expansion that's gonna get you. What's totally insane about all of that is only by sticking with it can you then truly appreciate the slow burn A Realm Reborn was, and all the ideas it introduces that later become very important. It's like when your parents gave you some advice as a kid and you didn't listen, and now you're 30 and you're like, damn, that was good advice. I should have listened. But again, how do you sell that to people? Meanwhile, the WoW starting experience is much more welcoming to new players because they keep updating it and changing it, a thing Final Fantasy XIV can't do without damaging the plot it's trying to set up. Because Warcraft doesn't concern itself.
Don't say can't. Don't say can't. It is not that they cannot fix this. It is that they have not fixed this. Yoshibi has regularly said that he would do things differently if he had the resources of WoW. That doesn't mean that would be included, but don't say can't. There are ways to welcome people in, especially as we come up on the point where there is going to be a finale to the story, even though the game is going to continue, starting a new story in 6.1. It is not that they cannot address the new player experience. It is that they have not addressed the new player experience outside of speeding it up.
With this, they now offer multiple ways to level, a special starting zone designed to teach new players. They have streamlined the process of getting your character to the end game, which, as we discussed, is a core design philosophy. But this means, depending on when you started playing, your story experience in World of Warcraft could be entirely different from another player. Some moments I may have experienced years ago are no longer in the game, making it so things that bind players and keep them engaged in the game are not story, but its progression systems, guild dynamics, and faction conflict, which I think explains why people enjoy playing Classic, as it has all the things I just listed, but also a shared sense of existing in the same world, which I feel like, I think many of you would say, the current iteration of WoW does not have. Another way to look at this is how new content is delivered. If we look at the two most recent completed content cycles in both WoW and 14, the picture we get of everything I've been talking about becomes more clear. In WoW, the new content starts with the release of a trailer, a big budget, stunningly well made, sometimes shocking reveal. It's usually a way for Blizzard to show the first major inciting story moment. This is something like Sylvanas breaking the Helm of Domination or Deathwing destroying the world. Then, before launch, there's a book and maybe some short stories about major characters involved in the next expansion. We'll get a pre-patch event, and then the expansion will release. And for the most part, every WoW expansion follows a similar formula. We get a short burst of main story, before pausing for leveling content, and eventually returning to the main plot. Then a major raid is released, and the story for the main plot continues, as we get a series of patches culminating in the last patch of the expansion, and the showdown with the big bad. Then the cycle begins again with a new trailer. Because of its heavily story-based nature, almost all of the content in 14 is delivered in-game. So, in the previous expansion's 4th major patch, you'll get hints of a new story. By the time the 5th major patch rolls around, you'll have more information, important details, or new jobs will be hinted at, and then, around the same time, we get the trailer.
We still get a trailer. That trailer actually develops over 3 fanfests.
Unlike WoW, it's not a single moment, but a series of vignettes and a hint of things to come in the next expansion. Then at launch, the main story is experienced and completed throughout the leveling process. The first major patch and so on are there to wrap up loose ends, tell new smaller stories either via raid or a series of max level trials, or introduce new areas that serve as a way to grind out special weapon skins. And then, by the end of the 3rd major patch, the story of the expansion is wrapped up, and then the 4th patch continues the trend of hinting at what will be in the new expansion. So once again, I'm sure the obvious difference comes down to the initial design choice by the two dev teams.
Keep in mind, this entire formula for 14 is changing next expansion. So, yes, the pattern in the past has been point 4 and 5 set up the story. Meanwhile, we're going through our 3 fanfest, revealing a ever-increasing length of trailer, because the trailer doesn't spoil anything until after it's been revealed in-game. And then we move into the expansion, we tell a big bulk, and then we tell it over point 1, 2, 3, wrap it up, and then point 4, 5 build to the next one. This time around, point 4 and 5 are actually continuing into 6.0, which will wrap it up. We will begin a new story with 1 through 5. We don't really know what happens after that. I think the key difference here is the pre-patch event. 14 doesn't really do a pre-patch event. I think there's a lot of advantages to a pre-patch event. The ability to test the new job changes would be a great thing to kind of see how that feels, even if it's not a perfect representation, especially because we're having a stat switch coming this time in 14, and so the pre-patch event of WoW is something I'm jealous of. It's really fun. It's like a big seasonal event would be in 14. It's individually written for that expansion. It's a one-time thing. You get to go through it and experience it as you build up the events of this expansion, as kind of a big group. So think about the bringing down of Dalmud at the end of 1.0. Think about Ishgardian Restoration. The pre-patch event is something really special, and I think that 14 could benefit from having a pre-patch. The big difference here is the books. While there are lore books for 14, absolutely. The fact that you need outside media, you need to go play Warcraft 3, you need to go read the books, you need to basically go follow Noble87 on Twitch, or go subscribe on YouTube to Noble87. You need to, or many of the other WoW creators, that's just my go-to. The fact that you need them because it's very opaque, kind of like My Name is Bife in Destiny, as opposed to lore creators in 14 are there to augment the story. They don't have as much of a role of being the person to help you understand what's going on. You already know what's going on. It was handed to you. Your character's the main character, so of course your character was there for all of it, as opposed to there's this cast of characters within World of Warcraft, and so it's really easy to miss things, especially because they have two faction stories in some expansions, like BFA, where the Alliance story and the Horde story are a little bit different.
The reason the Warcraft patch cycle is what it is to keep players engaged longer. So if you're a fan of story, for example, you need to keep with it through all the patches to see the end. While Final Fantasy XIV, designed to deliver story most of all, gives you a completed one at launch, then adds additional adventures afterwards.
So that's going to be the halfway point. I think that, yes, there is a key difference in the way that WoW and 14 handle story, and obviously Jesse has a huge emphasis on story, and so it means a great deal to him. And so when you compare my views where story is flavor in an MMO, and the intensity of that flavor is obviously different, but the reason I play is to be part of a community. The reason I play is for the multiplayer aspect. The reason I play, even if I'm not in multiplayer content, something like crafting and gathering, is to be in something that has other people in it with me. And so that's just different. And so my focus on that is going to feel less impacted by how different it is. But you cannot ignore how much story 14 has in it. And that WoW has story that's pushed in front of you, but only kinda.